NASA says right now is an awesome chance to focus on Venus, the world. This follows the new revelation of conceivable life in the world. If you somehow wound up taking a gander at NASA's records from the 1960s, you'd see the Space Office calling Venus a planet of discipline. At the same time, Mars changed into our four-appointed target. Such careful naming of the most far-off planets was entirely expected during the angry space race period. The Soviet Association was centered around sending expensive missions to Venus, the shocking planet, which showed basically no open doors for life. Yet the Soviet space program didn't decommission the Venera program until the fall of the Soviet Association. On account of Neil deGrasse Tyson, we finally know why. Join us as we break down the declassified photographs from Venus taken by the Soviet Association. The fall of the Soviet Association was dynamic in more ways than one. Not only did it alter the worldwide course of the world, but the absence of the domain also sank different insider facts with it. The truth that the Soviets had a huge bias for secrets, from running the most powerful intelligence organization in the world to being obscure about their extraterrestrial contact, means the former superpower holds unique secrets within itself. Before the United States of America governed most planetary tries in space, the Soviet Association was leading the game. While the domain has a long history of successful and unrewarding space missions, its most noteworthy focus was on the incredibly horrendous planet Venus. In the Russian language, you'd consider Venus to be Venera, and consequently, the resulting name of the mission that crossed from 1961 to 1983. During this time, the U.S. was caught up with sending its missions to the moon. So, in an odd manner, the Soviets chose to utilize their assets elsewhere. We can't say that the whole fixation on the second planet from our sun is odd. Did the Soviets hope to utilize the planet's surface as a fun and unprecedented military foundation, or were they perhaps expecting to colonize the planet later, looking for any sorts of life up there? It's very difficult to say why the Soviets were centered around the horrendous planet, since they named these expeditions during the Cold War. They weren't exactly forthcoming with their places and focuses. All that we know about the Venusian missions depends on declassified and unarchived proof. That being said, it's challenging to pinpoint what the Soviets were searching for, and if they ever uncovered the secrets of Venus. The Soviets didn't land on Venus when, 2 times or even multiple times. That is straightforward. The Soviets sent off 28 expensive rockets to the shocking planet, and 13 of those entered the Venusian air. While 8 handled these complex missions, it had put the Soviets in a driving situation in space exploration. Sure, the U.S. of America was a close second, but NASA was more impressed by satellites and imaginative plans than by exploring life on planets. Its emphasis on Mars came some time later. Neither particularly great nor particularly horrendous. Your set of experiences reading material may not let you know this, but the Soviet space program was the first organization to send a test into the environment of a planet other than Earth. It also had another store of firsts on its resume. The USSR became the first state to accomplish a delicate landing on another planet, and it brought back pictures and sounds from the outer layer of another planet. That's right, the Soviets had their own one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind moment well prior to the U.S. So, for what reason do we only incidentally catch wind of such accomplishments? Remember what we said about the Soviet bias for secrecy? That is only one of the many explanations for the oversight of the Soviet space program. Back in 1992, the renowned organization was decommissioned in the result of the USSR, and the office had to be re-established with a new Russian identity, Roscosmos. A lot of its historical data was either lost or obliterated. This is precisely why we don't have an unambiguous response for why the Soviets sent off 28 rockets into the Venusian air. At any rate, if we had to make the most sensible estimate, maybe the Soviet choice to inspect Venus was about cost efficiency more than anything else. It's not to say the space program wasn't worried about the practicality of the planet. They were searching for judicious water presence, the power of solar radiation, and the overall characteristics of the planet. Without a series of these space missions, it would have been almost impossible to measure Venus's high temperatures and thick atmosphere. Today, different cosmologists make an effort not to believe that the stunning planet could support life. The temperatures there are sufficiently high to dissolve lead, and water is scant. In addition, because of its thick atmosphere, the climatic tension on Venus is ordinarily that of Earth. Anyway, these are incredibly later improvements, and to disregard the USSR's contribution to the investigation of Venus is comparable to adjusting history to the extent that the Soviets were concerned Venus was worth investigating, regardless of whether it was simply to compete in the space race. You see, examining more sensible planets wasn't Mars precisely off the table, yet it was more expensive than sending tests to Venus. All that simply boils down to the distance from Earth to another celestial body. On average, the horrible planet is just 40 million kilometers away from our home, while Mars, on average, is 250 million kilometers away. Such enormous differences in distance add up to significant differences in cost. If the U.S. wasn't the world's largest economy, it would never have been easy to concentrate on Mars. Various reports suggest that Soviet missions were hazardous and had significant technical gaps. Obviously, the shuttles weren't fit to cover limitless distances, and the USSR had a history of losing contact with its rockets. So, it makes sense why the Soviet space program chose a shorter and closer venture that would yield results. However, if we don't consider the space race in this context, the tale of the Venera missions would be incomplete. The U.S. wasn't even on the space map when the Soviet program launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957. This move intensified the space tussle and maintained Soviet strength. What's truly interesting is the reasoning behind why the U.S. focused on the Moon. NASA had a series of failures with its Venus missions during the 1960s, which led to the Venus curse. Each time they launched a probe into the Venusian atmosphere, it ended in failure. This is precisely when the Soviet Union saw an opportunity to capitalize on NASA's failures. At the time, both the U.S. and the Soviets were determined to win the space race. The most reliable strategy was to exploit different options. It was a victory, specifically for the Soviet space program, which seized Earth's sister planet as its significant achievement in the space rivalry, accomplishing what its main rival had failed to do. Despite the Soviet Union's limited resources and struggling government, it repeatedly launched missions to Venus to solidify its winning position against the U.S., instead of focusing on NASA's central target, the Moon. This strategic division wasn't without resistance and misleading propaganda. To cover their major failures with Venus, the American media branded Venus the evil planet, while Mars became mankind's destiny. These labels didn't matter to the Soviets. Their mission was to demonstrate superiority over the Americans, and they weren't unsuccessful in doing so. The Venera missions are almost forgotten in present history. But despite their outdated beginnings, those missions were incredibly complex, advanced, and ambitious. In fact, if we had to choose an event that marked the beginning of the space age, the Venera missions would take the lead. Going back to the 1950s, the Soviets started experimenting with the design and technical aspects of probes, and for the next 30 years, they continued to build and launch interplanetary spacecraft as part of the Venera program. Since the program ran parallel to the intense Cold War, the Soviets focused on advancing their resources. Fortunately for them, the early years of the conflict provided them with more serious technical work capacity than the U.S., which proved invaluable in developing their capabilities. The USSR began to build and launch larger rockets, designed to endure high altitudes and long distances. The Soviets rushed to experiment with both manned and unmanned spacecraft. Meanwhile, the Soviet academic community worked on a series of calculations to create accurate trajectories for the Venus missions. In the background, their Mars programs were also running successfully. For the Soviet Space Agency, nothing was more important than developing sophisticated instrumentation for these probes, which led to the biggest breakthrough in the history of space exploration. In 1966, the Soviet agency launched Venera 3, making it the first artificial probe to enter the atmosphere of Venus and successfully reach the planet's surface. This landmark achievement heightened the rivalry between the two superpowers. Unlike the American missions, which were bogged down with failures and dead ends, the Soviet program continued to make progress. Despite constant challenges, the USSR managed to send successful probes into the Venusian atmosphere. The most critical issue with this approach was limited design capacity. The Soviets quickly overcame their design issues and launched the most sophisticated rockets of the Venera program during the 1970s. Their advanced technology allowed them to carry out the first dual launches of Venera 4 and Venera 5. According to most historians, this was the most fascinating decade in the history of space exploration. Without a doubt, the U.S. attempted to come up with comparable launch plans. But why did the Soviet agency choose dual launches to Venus? To understand this, you must recognize that interplanetary travel requires advanced instrumentation to gather significant data and evidence. Of course, the spacecraft were first launched to study the planet's surface. This is precisely what happened with Venera 4. Since the launch went smoothly and the spacecraft entered Venus's atmosphere, the Soviet program moved forward with Venera. It wasn't simply a reiteration of the first. The subsequent rocket was explicitly intended to gather new information about the planet. In this manner, the Soviets expected to break through boundaries of temperature, environmental tension, and radiation on Venus. They didn't want to wait too long for their response. By the mid-1970s, the Soviet program was entering the most exceptional time of the Venera missions. All that the USSR had done up to that point was about research and advancement. It was tied to ensuring that their plans and advancements were optimized. It was also about perfecting the methods and mechanics of interplanetary travel. However, for the second decade of Venera missions, the Soviet Union planned to lead exploratory missions. The best and most captivating launch of this period was Venera 7. As the 11th Soviet test entered Venus' atmosphere, it became the first spacecraft to send data from another planet. The planet's high temperatures, density, and surface pressures were noted at that point. The Soviets were also trying to record Venusian sounds. The next major achievement for the program came in the mid-1980s. Venera 13 had outperformed all previous interplanetary assessments in terms of complexity. This spacecraft was the first to capture full-color, panoramic images of Venus' surface. At the same time, the Soviet program launched Venera 14 to gather similar information about the planet's surface. The Soviet Union was seemingly the only country to discover and recognize Venus. The Russian Space Agency has re-established its aspirations for Venus missions. Veda is a planned joint mission between Roscosmos and NASA to study the atmosphere and surface of Venus. The abbreviation Veda represents love in Russian, and it is expected to launch in the late 2020s or mid-2030s. It aims to study the planet's climate, geological history, and search for signs of past or present habitability. The spacecraft will include an orbiter, a lander, and possibly an inflatable to study the planet's environment in detail. The legacy of the Venera mission stretches far beyond their mechanical achievements and global implications. These missions, initiated by the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War, represented a pinnacle of human imagination and determination in exploring the universe. Despite facing numerous challenges and hardships, the Soviets pressed on in their mission to uncover the mysteries of Venus, a planet long believed to be hostile and cold to life. One of the most critical aspects of the Venera missions was their pioneering use of mechanical tests to study planetary atmospheres and surfaces. These missions paved the way for future exploration beyond Earth's vicinity and laid the foundation for our understanding of planetary science. The data gathered by the Venera spacecraft provided valuable insights into Venus's extreme climate, including its scorching temperatures, crushing atmospheric pressure, and toxic air dominated by carbon dioxide. Additionally, the technological advancements achieved through the Venera program had broader implications for space exploration as a whole. The creation of heat-resistant materials, robust communication systems, and reliable landing methods contributed to subsequent missions to other planets, such as Mars and beyond. The lessons learned from the Venera missions continue to inform rocket design and operational strategies in contemporary space exploration efforts. Beyond their scientific and technological significance, the Venera missions also had major social and political ramifications during the space race era. These missions symbolized the competition between superpowers for dominance in space exploration. For the Soviet Union, succeeding in the Venera missions was not just about scientific discovery, but also about demonstrating technological prowess and ideological superiority over the U.S. The global community closely monitored each Venera mission, recognizing its significance in expanding humanity's understanding of the solar system. The successful soft landing of Venera 7 on Venus in 1970 marked a major milestone as the first spacecraft to send data from another planetary surface. This achievement showcased the Soviet Union's ability to overcome the enormous challenges posed by Venus' harsh conditions. Besides scientific instruments, the Venera spacecraft carried cameras that captured the first close-up images of Venus' surface. These pictures revealed a rugged landscape dominated by plains and volcanic features, providing researchers with significant insights into the planet's history and development. The panoramic photographs taken by later missions, such as Venera 13 and 14, further enhanced our understanding of Venus' surface morphology and structure. Despite their triumphs, the Venera missions also faced their share of failures and challenges. Several missions either failed to reach Venus or experienced technical glitches that prevented them from transmitting data back to Earth. The difficulties of operating in Venus' hostile environment, including extreme temperatures exceeding 450 degrees Celsius (842 degrees Fahrenheit), and corrosive sulfuric acid clouds, presented significant engineering challenges for spacecraft design and operation. Nevertheless, the persistence and dedication of Soviet scientists and engineers involved in the Venera program paved the way for future missions to Venus and other celestial bodies. The legacy of the Venera missions lives on in the ongoing exploration of Venus by space agencies worldwide, including NASA's upcoming Vega mission in cooperation with Roscosmos. Looking ahead, the Vega mission aims to build upon the accomplishments of its predecessors by sending advanced instruments to study Venus' atmosphere, surface geology, and potential signs of past or present habitability. The mission represents a collaborative effort to unravel the remaining mysteries of Earth's nearest planetary neighbor and to expand our understanding of the conditions that could support life beyond our own planet.